So for tonight, I kind of a thing was that when God, when I was praying about what to talk about tonight, it was fitting in a lot of ways, but also it was something that like God had been talking to myself and Heather a lot about over the weekend. And even more than that, so there's this thing that's always kind of happened with this group. And like a lot of the messages that God gives me, like I don't know about it until later. Like somebody will come from Bridgetown and tell me about it, which is an old church that I was part of. And like usually Dusty will be like, it's weird that you're talking about that this week because that's what they're talking about at Bridgetown. And I'm just like, oh, okay, that's nice. I don't like, it was a bad falling out with that church, so I don't tend to go back and like watch any of their stuff or listen to a lot of it. But in this occasion, you know, Heather had been listening to a few of their sermons on the subject of ruthlessly eliminating hurry from your life. And one of the topics that they discussed was silence, which is what I was given to talk about tonight. And usually, you know, I don't know about it and whatnot. And in this case, when I was praying about it, God was just like, I want you to talk about silence. And I was just kind of like, you want me to follow that church, really? And he was just kind of like, Nathan, don't let your pride get in the way of my message. And I was just kind of like, that's fine. That's fine. So, we're talking about silence. And the reason why I tell that story and to kind of preface is because like I'll reference a couple of things that I actually got from those sermons and listening to them. Because there were a couple of specific things that were there. So this is less like just revelation on the spot, which is not really the way that I like it, but it is what it is. So, talking about silence and the value of it is kind of a weird subject in a lot of ways. We don't tend to value the concept, and in fact a lot of people are actually genuinely made uncomfortable by silence. Like, personally I've never really understood it, but there are a lot of people that are like that. The moment that the room goes quiet, they suddenly have to talk because they have to fill that vacuum with whatever they can, any kind of noise. I always remember when I lived up with Dusty and her mom for about a year. They live in like Estacada, right above the high school, heading out towards the wilderness. And it's just quiet, dead silent every night. The only thing you hear are, after about 9-10 o'clock, are either crickets and grasshoppers or the wind, and that's it. Like, it's a small town and everyone goes to bed pretty early. And I remember going from that, and that was really peaceful, really nice in a lot of ways. I got accustomed to it really quick. And then I moved in with my mom because I was supposed to help take care of her for a while. And my mom sleeps with the TV on, running westerns all night long.
The shooting?
Mm-hmm. Oh no, there's screaming and horses and shooting and more shooting. And I remember just like, I would just go lay in bed, and then my brother would also sleep with the TV on. He'd be running like South Park or Family Guy on just all the way through, or Archer. Gal, Archer. I just can't. That show just killed me. There were so many times when I'd just be like laying there in bed and suddenly I'd hear the most off the wall, most random, ridiculous thing, and I'd be like, what? Have to get up and go stare at the TV for a moment. Of course, it's like 5 o'clock in the morning and I was trying to sleep 5 hours ago.
Mhm.
So that was life, and it was very different and involved a lot of not sleeping for a long time. But more than that, the bigger thing than that, though, was kind of the more dynamic change of what my kind of, I don't want to say spiritual life, because that's not quite right, but my internal kind of functioning and ability went out the window in a lot of ways. Because see, the thing about it is that there's a reason why when we meditate, we oftentimes sit in silence, or with something rather unobtrusive being played in the background. There's a reason why when people think, they oftentimes go to places that are quiet. And there's an innate value to that, because it allows us to be able to be free of the distractions and really focus in on what's going on inside. And that's a really big deal for all of us. And the funny thing about Christianity is nobody really talks about this, but there are a few different facets of that. One, meditation is a thing that we discuss. And Christian meditation is very different from, say, Eastern meditation, in the sense that when you talk about Eastern meditation, it's a removing of your thoughts and kind of pushing it all to the outside to empty yourself so that you can just sit in that peace. Whereas in the Bible, when they talk about meditation and kind of the typical Christian modus operandi is to, look over scriptures or things that God has said or done and just kind of ruminate on that and just sit with it and think about it and let it kind of run through your process and through your mind to digest it. But in both cases, it involves going to a place of silence. Because it's hard to think about something. One, it's hard to push things out of your mind when you're surrounded by noise. It's also hard to sit and really think about something when you're surrounded by noise and distractions. And even in that process, like when we talk about Christianity, one of the biggest things that we run into where silence ends up being important is, one, giving us a moment free of the world around us is a really big deal, and I'll kind of expound on that in a minute. But the other part about it is when we talk about people hearing from God and different things like that, most of those prophets in these stories were not sitting in rooms full of people singing hymns or different things like that. I mean, a number of the stories involve people. Moses went up onto a mountain away from everybody to talk to God. Some of the different prophets ran off into the wilderness to talk to God. Even Jesus, at different points in time throughout the scriptures, Jesus is going out by himself alone to spend time in silence, talking to God and just receiving from him. In the story of the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus is praying in Matthew 26, he's sitting there by himself. He has a couple disciples go with him, and they just fall asleep. So he's out in the garden by himself, praying to God. And the reason why I point to that one, we'll talk about a little further, but later. But there's a certain value to getting alone and spending that time and even letting the silence kind of be there for a minute. See, the big thing about it is that it helps us kind of order our thoughts, helps us to kind of feel what's going on inside of us and even like be able to grab a hold of it. You know, if you're particularly frustrated by something that's going on, you might only know that you're frustrated. You might not know why. And then if you're just surrounded by more distractions and different things like that that are just drawing your attention all the time, you're probably not going to grab onto what that reason is. You're probably just going to be frustrated. And half those distractions are probably going to be more frustrating. So it just kind of creates a sort of snowball effect. And then you're pissed off and you don't really know why, but you have some reason and you know that you're frustrated. And then you start acting out in that frustration. And you become more easily agitated by other people. The same can be true of a number of other emotions: depression, anxiety. Oh, anxiety is so easy to fall into with this. I remember, like, just to give like an example of that, going out and visiting my dad in Minnesota some years ago and going around and just talking to people. Everybody's in these small towns. I mean, there was one right next to the one that my dad was in where you could hunt deer in the town as long as you were using a bow and arrow. Like, we're talking rural. But the thing with it was that all of these people were just anxious and terrified because they were just surrounded with news stories and rumors that were being passed around, and all of them were things about like the big one that was happening while I was there was clowns. Everyone was afraid of clowns because apparently it started with one story where somebody dressed up as a clown and went out and started killing people, and that was on the news. But then all the other stories started coming up as people started spreading stories to one another. And it was just like, I sat there and like people would come and tell me all these stories about clowns walking around in the area and killing people and stuff like that. Or, you know, there was somebody's house where they got surrounded by clowns and things like that. I'm just like, how many of these stories are actually real? Well, my friend told me this story and, you know, I believe her. Okay, but where did she get it? Well, I don't know. Okay, so maybe we can relax a little bit because maybe that's not real. But it just kind of like stands as an example of the way that anxiety can function. And we all know that media, news specifically, tends to function on stories that scare people because those get the most attention. Everybody looks to the news to know what they need to be afraid of and what they need to be prepared for. And the news understands that, so they perpetuate those stories. And then we wonder why why anxiety is such a prevalent issue in our country and in our culture. I mean, I just read this thing the other day talking about how millennials, as a generation, are actually some of the most physically and mentally unhealthy people in all of the generations, which is bewildering. But at the same time, there it was. And it came down to a lot of the anxiousness and different emotional states that are caused by so much around us. Being poor. But also being scared of being poor. And also being angry about being poor. So there are all these different things that are kind of constantly pressing on us. And then when we think about it, you know, even the point of the whole sermon series from Bridgetown is talking about kind of removing ourselves from the kind of society that we have that's very, very, very pushed all the time. We're either very distracted or we're very harried by societal expectations and different things that we're constantly having to look at and deal with, whether it's social media or company involved, like work, people, friends, all of these different things that are involved in life that really just press down on us. And as a result, create a very toxic circumstance that keeps us distracted and focused away from things and keeps us from being able to just stop and be present, to be conscious of the moment and to be conscious of ourselves. So, in a lot of ways, finding a place of silence can actually be an exceptional way of separating yourself out from the constant din of the world and give yourself a moment to just kind of like feel what's going on, to kind of touch base with who you are instead of what's going on around you all the time. And that's really important. You know, a lot of people don't really know who they are. We all kind of present facsimiles of this person that we want to project, or this image that we want to project, and we push and pursue and try to convince ourselves of that. And it doesn't really matter what you believe in. That's just a cultural aspect. Fake it till you make it is as American as apple pie and baseball used to be. And it's as much a part of the American church as the crucifix. So we devote all this time to trying to be somebody. You know, whether you're trying to adhere to a collection of rules and regulations that you call your religion, or you're trying to live your best life, it's all the same thing in the sense that you're grabbing onto whatever you can to try to tell everybody who you are. And that's usually just things that you look at and see and like. I mean, we're a culture that functions on envy and shame. That's really bad. And that's something that we definitely need to be removing ourselves from, rather than constantly being fed all the time. So sometimes it's really important to take a break from that. Probably one of the things that stood out to me most in those sermons, and it was something that really lingered with me, and like the whole weekend was spent in more or less in a state of silence, because the internet died. So Heather and I were just kind of like stuck there for the week, or for that 3-4 days, having very limited access to the outside world unless we like drove somewhere or did something. But we couldn't hop on the computer, we couldn't watch movies on, you know, YouTube or Hulu or Netflix or Disney Plus or whatever, you know. We just had to sit there and be present, and it was just a lot of wind and us, and that was it. Heather had downloaded these sermons, though, onto her phone, so we had those and we listened to them. And I think one of the things that stood out to me most, this one particular line, which the pastor at Bridgetown was quoting from somebody else that he read, and in that game of telephone, the original speaker of this got lost. But the quote was something to the effect of, the greatest danger to the Christian spiritual life is not the people telling them, or is not science, as though science has disproven the unprovable. but it is the constant din of secularism. And the reason why that stood out to me was thinking about a lot of what social media is and what I see every day when I hop on Facebook and the news and YouTube and every kind of hub of culture and what's perpetuated in that. And the biggest thing about it was that, I mean, this will come across a certain way, but what that reminded me of was something that Adolf Hitler used to say. And what he said was, if you tell a lie loud enough and long enough, someone will believe you. And that's how it starts, is that once they believe you, then others will start to believe you. And the reason why I bring that up is because when it comes down to it, when you're constantly surrounded by one specific message or one specific idea, it doesn't matter that if you don't believe it per se, because the constant hearing of it will break you down. One other thing that popped up to memory was an episode of Star Trek, obscurely, where the captain of the ship got kidnapped, or got taken prisoner, and he was being tortured. And the person torturing him would show him, I think it went about like this. He would show him 3 lights. He would show the captain 3 lights and then torture him and tell him there were 4 lights, effectively gaslighting him over and over and over again. And he would do this every day. And the captain would hold on to the fact that there were 3 lights there, and he would just keep getting tortured and tortured and tortured and tortured. Each time that captor would stop and tell him there are 4 lights. And the thing is that at the end of the episode, right before he was freed, he was being put through these rigors, and he had a moment where he stopped, and he still pushed through that there were only 3 lights. But later on, when he was back on his ship and freed from the prison, he looked at he was talking to, I believe it was the ship counselor, and he was just like, I could have sworn that there were in fact 4 lights. I'd started to see it. And this is an extreme example of what can be a very mundane thing. Because the truth is that it's not always such an extreme thing. It can be very small things. I mean, social media has been a really fantastic vector for a lot of very, very obvious lies. But people have perpetuated them not knowing any better, or presuming that this is true. And a lot of people have had a lot of fun with that. But it stands as an example to kind of recognize how, when we're constantly immersed in a specific set of views and ideals, that we can end up becoming a part of that, even if we're staunchly against it, even that we're very clear. It's just that constant immersion can push a person in one particular direction. You can become influenced. In basic training, they use the term indoctrination. It was brainwashing, and the drill sergeants were content to explain that, but they used indoctrination because that's the official term. And that's the point. and don't, and just to clarify something when I talk about this, this isn't like the church is free of this, okay? I've spent so many years working in the church, and in those years there have been plenty spent talking to people about things that aren't actually true that they claim are in the Bible. I mean, even when we talked about like spiritual warfare, there were so many things that we talked about where it was just like, why do people believe this? Okay, like, for example, even just recently we talked about the fact that, Satan. Everybody in church believes that Satan was the choir director or the head minstrel of God. And it's just like, well, that's actually nowhere in the Bible. In no point in any holy text does it actually say that, yet that's something that's very, very well believed in the church. Why? And, I mean, that's just one example of many, many things that are very commonly revered as truths in the church. Even the idea, like I just mentioned, the whole fake it till you make it thing. That's a consistent thing in the church. Like, faith isn't a matter of belief, it's a matter of making yourself believe. That's not true either. Like, if you take a leap of faith, it's not because you've convinced yourself that it's going to happen. I mean, it might be, it's just that doesn't mean anything's going to happen from it. But that's the point, is just that, there are a lot of concepts that have been very twisted and become very twisted because somebody on a pulpit said it one time, and then a lot of people believed them, and as a result, they got taken to places that were very dark. Even when you look back at church history, you see things like the indulgences that the Catholic priests gave out, or the idea that if you went on a crusade and killed Muslims, then all of your sins would be forgiven. Like, there's a long, rich history of taking everything in here and twisting it and jumbling it into weird, strange ideals, and then moving those forward. So, when I talk about the value of separating yourself out from society for a minute, there's an interesting thing that can happen in that you can gain a little bit of levity here and be able to kind of get back in touch with what you actually believe. And also, when you don't have somebody constantly saying something to you, you get a moment to pick it apart and determine that, I'm pretty sure that's a lie, or I'm pretty sure that that person is just completely full of crap. But it gives you a chance to be able to, like, think, to feel, to investigate, to delve in, to research, to do whatever you need to do in order to reassociate with what you actually believe, and also what seems to actually be factual. Because, see, one of the things that I remember very distinctly in basic training was that they would ride you until you believed what they wanted you to believe. I remember getting into it with one of my drill sergeants. My drill sergeants loved me so much because they were having us recite the Army values. They just kept having us recite the Army values over and over and over again. And the acronym was leadership. And I remember coming to the honor point, and we had this old drill sergeant, and he was talking about it, and I was just kind of like, he was taking questions, because he decided to sit us all down and tell us about what it was going to be like being soldiers and what it meant and everything. And I'd been talking to a lot of the other recruits, and the thing about them was that they had just come from the recruiters' offices, and the recruiters were like used car salesmen. They will lie to you in order to get you to sign up. and they get a bonus for it. And I had people sitting there telling me, and I had no illusions about what I was getting into. I knew it was going to be bad. I was familiar with the indoctrination techniques and different things like that that they use. But I remember, like, all these other guys around me were just like, oh, it's going to be great, it's going to be so much fun. One guy just had it described to him as being like going to a resort with machine guns. And I'm just listening to all these poor guys, I'm just like, dude, you're not gonna, this isn't gonna be fun, okay? No, it'll be fun. No, you've been lied to. But I remember getting up when he was talking about that, and I asked him, I was just the drill sergeant, I was just kind of like, so the acronyms for, you know, we talk about the Army values, we talk about leadership, and I was like, honor is such a big important thing, but what's the honor in having people that you're hiring go out and lie to people to convince them to come here so that they can be tortured effectively? So that was the end of that conversation. He just kind of like looked at me and he was like, well, the thing about it is that sometimes when the world goes a certain way, you have to kind of meet the world, and you know, I actually gotta head out. Very busy. So that was the end of that. They would also tell us that the American Army had never been beaten in war. And the drill sergeants would keep saying that, and every time I'd just be like, what about Vietnam? And then we would go do push-ups. So the point is that, you know, that was kind of the technique, was just to keep telling you things and then force you to believe them. And the other aspect of that was you're taken out of your family, out of your friends, away from everybody that you know and love, away from any familiar surroundings, and you put onto a base surrounded by a bunch of people who are constantly being harassed and harried by some guy in a hat, and until everyone's broken down and depressed, and some of them are actually going crazy. And that's what basic training is like. And you're not given a chance to have a moment to think. Instead, you're constantly doing something. Whether you're running, you're in class of some kind, you're running more, or you're doing some kind of training exercise, or you're cleaning, or you're running again. That is what they do. They don't want you to think. They don't want you to have a moment to process what's going on or where you're at. But that's kind of the gist of it. Being outside of circumstances like that, we have the opportunity to take a minute and disconnect. And that's invaluable. So, let's go ahead and take a break for a minute, and then we'll come back in like 10 or a minute. So,
What's Greg?
okay. So, you know, the next thing to talk about here relating to I think I've pretty well beaten to death the point about like why there's a value in having moments of silence. But you know, the other side of it is what happens when you take that. Because it's not always cut and dry, and more than that, sometimes it's not always pleasant. You know, you've got something really going on inside of you, and you might not even be able to feel it because it's just buried under distractions. And then suddenly you have to, because you're just kind of left with it. You know, I think of times where I've had to do this for myself, because early on in my understanding of, living as a Christian and whatnot, I had it brought up that solitude was very important to kind of the ebb and flow of life as a follower of Jesus. Not isolation, but solitude. Taking a moment, getting away from people, maybe even a day. And in fact, this was something that I was taught when I was going to Bridgetown. But there are plenty of times where I've done that, taken that day, gone out, and then been left with whatever's going on. And kind of the crappy part about that is it can be a real mixed bag of different things. Say, for example, there were times when I was really angry at God or people, or especially the church. The first one and the last one were pretty normal things for me to be mad at. And suddenly I have a moment where I'm left to just kind of become aware of what my actual feelings were. And at times I could be very surprised by exactly how deep that anger went and where it came from. Or in circumstances of depression, finding out exactly how hurt I actually was by life or by situations, and how I'd been angry before, and it turned out that anger was just a really convenient distraction. Because the truth is that a lot of people, and I came to find this out by talking to people at large, and the thing that I learned is that people they migrate towards feelings of anger before they migrate to feelings of pain. A lot of people get hurt and they go right to anger because it's a fine distraction rather than actually feeling what's going on there in terms of where their heart's really at. And the thing of it is that unless you actually stop and allow yourself to process through those feelings and even see it for what it is, it's a good screen, and you'll just keep it up. A lot of people do that and they become emotionally stunted. So taking that time and just kind of feeling through what's going on, or letting yourself become cognizant of it, it can be rough. It can be rough, but it's also restorative. It also allows you're allowed the opportunity to process through what's going on instead of just letting it linger or burying it under some distraction or something, or some other emotional response or whatever. I've sat with so many different church groups and so many different people in church groups, and sat with them through those moments where they're processing through different hurts that they've gone through. I mean, everything from child abuse that they suffered, to abandonment that they suffered, to rejections that they suffered. There's a great many things. I mean, even just that overarching feeling that this isn't fair, that a lot of us struggle with as we look at who we are against the backdrop of what life has offered us. And especially when we talk about it in terms of, we're Christians and we believe in God and we believe that God wants to provide us good things, except life's been really, really crappy, to say the least. So then you have to kind of face that dynamic of you're being the best Christian that you can be, and it seems to be that the prize that you get is a crappy life. I sat and gave those sermons that said, life is what it is. God doesn't always control every facet of it. He doesn't make your life crappy. The world is the way it is, and life is that. And yet at the same time, having said all that, I was also the person sitting there quietly in my car, parked up at the Vista House, looking out at the view, and being legitimately livid at God because of how I felt betrayed by him, that I had been giving him everything that I had, and had just had a church group fall apart because they decided to turn on me, or just lost my job, or whatever. So, therefore, I was homeless again. These kinds of things come up. But the opportunity here is to be able to process through them. And that's, there's kind of like a duality to that, by the way. Because on the one hand, we either bury those feelings and then they kind of like can take over and cripple us, or we ignore those feelings and try to press on in the other direction. So it's like we're going to either bury them and become more bitter, or we're going to bury them and try to like pretend like they never happened and try to be good, even though like we're dying inside. And we're just going to keep trying to pretend like we're okay and keep doing our own thing until, you know, eventually we break. Both are bad, obviously. Like, that's not a subjective thing. Objectively, it's destructive to our emotional health and our psychological health. So, in order to maintain those aspects of ourselves, we do need to take a moment and allow ourselves to kind of process through what's going on. It doesn't matter what type of person you are, you're inevitably going to have to face those things. Like, you know, I know that for myself, I'm the type of person that I have to kind of like, I do specifically have to take a break and kind of chew on what's going on or what hurt or whatever in order to process through it. And there are other people where they have other ways of handling this, but we're all going to have to do that. Whatever it is that works, it's going to have to be done. And oftentimes it's going to involve not being surrounded by noise. And that's going to be extremely important. And the other part of it is, you know, like I was talking about how a lot of the stories in the Bible of the prophets and Moses and Jesus involved them going to God in times of silence and basically creating silence so that they'd be able to hear him. And that's a pretty, for every Christian, and like I've walked people through this state of going from, you know, being a believer to being somebody that does understand, does hear from God. You know, basically kind of helping get people from this point over here to this point over here, where suddenly like they start actually hearing from God and realizing that, oh, this is real. And the thing is that in every one of those instances is that it becomes important to get into those places of silence. Because oftentimes it's not going to be something so abrupt as having like, you know, a storm fall down before you. It's very seldom that you have a Job thing go on where a tornado shows up and starts speaking to you. Usually when people hear God, it is still and quiet. And you know you're not hearing from, you know it's not you, but it's definitely a foreign voice But at the same time, you know, it's quiet enough to where if you were surrounded by music or people or Facebook, you wouldn't be able to recognize it, hear it, notice it. You might miss it. So there's this thing where when we do want to hear from him, oftentimes it's important to get to that place of quiet so we can. But just because you get into a quiet place doesn't mean you will. I mean, and I give that and say that because even in the story of the Garden of Gethsemane, which was the verse that I was given for tonight, or, you know, the one. You know, we read this story of Jesus sitting there and talking to God. And I'll go through it real fast. In Matthew 26, starting in verse 36, when Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Could you men not keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. "Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak." He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." Then he came back. He again found them sleeping, because their eyes were heavy. So he left them and went away once more, and prayed the 3rd time, saying the same thing. Then he returned to the disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour is near, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise and let us go. Here comes my betrayer." While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. This was the story before he was taken away to be crucified. And he knew it was coming. That's why he was going off and praying. But God didn't talk to him when he went off and prayed. He prayed, and he heard nothing in response. He finally ends that prayer by saying, you know, "Let your will be done." The point is that even in this state of, as described, deep sorrow and trouble, you know, Jesus was left to kind of pray and just be in that silence. And that happens. Like, it's not a factor of the fact that you showed up, now you're going to get this. It's just what it is. We don't always earn anything by from our efforts. Even some of the hardest things that we work on can end up being fruitless. And the truth is, going to a place of quiet to just try to talk to God doesn't mean that you're going to like summon God and he's going to like come before you and talk or anything like that. At the end of the day, we always have to remember that he's a sovereign being. It's no more true that if I go drive over to Grant's house, one, he's gonna be there, two, he's gonna like come out and see me. He probably will if he's there, but it doesn't mean it's for sure. Sometimes we just have to be left with that silence, though, in order to process, in order to feel. And the funny thing about God is that what I've experienced myself is that sometimes he leaves us in that silence just to allow us the opportunity to feel exactly what comes up from that. I'm somebody who has had deep issues with rejection, created by years of suffering it in different ways and shape and form. And any time that I go and try to pray and talk to God and I get nothing, that stuff comes up really quickly. And there was one point where I remember for a week solidly, I would go and pray and ask God to talk to me, and I wouldn't get anything in response. And by the end of the week, I had just kind of resigned to believe that God didn't want to talk to me anymore. And finally, I went up and prayed to him, and he asked me, he was like, "What has all this made you feel?" And I talked to him about it, and he was just like, "Is that really healthy? Like, you're so quick to believe this because you have so many wounds over it." And it became a thing to talk about and to even be offered up in prayer because I wasn't aware of it. I didn't see it as a problem. I thought it was normal to just, automatically assume that anybody that doesn't want to talk to you even once doesn't want to talk to you at all, ever again, for any reason. Apparently that's not how everybody thinks. So, like I said before, it's important sometimes for us to kind of feel through these things. So, the value in this being that we're allowed to, or allotted an opportunity to think through, feel through, learn, even about some of the stuff that's going on inside of us that maybe we're not completely aware of. And sometimes we need that. And even beyond that, there's also a part about learning who we are. See, one thing that can be really problematic about community is that sometimes people will get stuck on an idea of who you are, and they start projecting that onto you. And the truth is, or they start having an expectation that they want you to meet, or any number of different things. And sometimes we need a moment away to kind of remember who we are. And also maybe arrive at the conclusion that maybe we don't need to be part of that community if they're gonna actually project an identity onto us and then effectively oppress us with that. It's probably not a good place to be. Sometimes even a good identity can be destructive. Especially when it starts to cripple you. So that's about what I got.